Opening up lines for the queen and king's bishop immediately offers dynamic play and centers the pawn structure. Instantly mirroring the central pawn contest, 1e5 ignites an immediate clash for control, demanding precise piece development to avoid early positional disadvantages. Instantly targets black's central pawn, forcing an immediate defensive decision and initiating development. Developing a piece to control the center and prepare for pawn advances, this knight bravely guards the e-pawn and opens lines for bishop activity. Instantly targets black's central pawn and prepares development, creating immediate pressure and influencing black's piece placement. Challenging the bishop's placement directly, black forces a decision, potentially sacrificing pawn structure for tempo. Retreating the bishop maintains the pawn structure, while keeping the knight's diagonal open for future action. Challenging white's piece placement, this knight develops actively, creating immediate central tension and preparing to strike at the e4 pawn. Securing the monarch now frees up pieces for central engagement and potential queenside pressure. A tactical gamble to disrupt white's development, though it potentially sacrifices central influence for immediate contact. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white boldly contests black's knight intrusion, immediately aiming to dismantle the pawn center and open lines for piece development. Embracing the initiative, black pushes the bishop back and gains valuable central space with this pawn thrust, forcing white to confront the doubled pawns and potentially creating weaknesses. Retreating the bishop to **BB* maintains pressure on the e5 pawn while avoiding the immediate threat from black's bishop on c8. This repositioning also opens a diagonal for potential queenside counterplay and defensively solidifies the kingside if black decides to push forward aggressively. It signals white's intention to consolidate their position and prepare for a more positional struggle rather than a sharp tactical melee. Boldly challenging white's central control, black ignites a positional pawn battle, aiming to disrupt white's knight development and potentially free their own pieces. This aggressive pawn push signals a willingness to embrace complexity and fight for space. Opening the central e-file creates immediate pressure on black's kingside, forcing a strategic decision regarding piece placement and pawn structure. This pawn capture disrupts black's central pawn chain, potentially opening lines for future attack, or, conversely, creating a target for counterplay. Consider the implications for piece development and central control. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal. This maneuver subtly aims to contest control of key squares and potentially launch a queenside pawn storm. Anchoring the central pawn on c3 solidifies the e4 pawn, preventing its immediate recapture, and prepares to develop the queenside further, perhaps with the idea of b4 to contest black's queenside expansion. Asserting control over the central dark squares, the bishop now eyes the vulnerable kingside, preparing to pressure white's castled monarch and potentially exchange for a knight that guards the critical f2 square. Positioning the knight on d2 opens up a clear line for the queen and prepares for a potential kingside attack by reinforcing the f3 knight. It also offers a safe haven if the knight on f3 becomes a target. Castling into safety solidifies the king's position, addressing the latent threats on the kingside and preparing to connect the rooks for future operations. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop gracefully reestablishes a balanced pawn structure, simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside and reinforcing the bishop's diagonal coverage towards black's queenside. Unleashing a bishop to a diagonal that directly challenges white's central control, black aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, particularly the knight on d2, and potentially force concessions on the queenside. Unleashing the knight towards the queenside, white seeks to disrupt black's harmonious pawn structure and potentially gain a foothold on the b-file, a bold maneuver that sacrifices some immediate central control for future queenside pressure. Challenging the knight's position with the bishop, black aims to disrupt white's harmonious setup, potentially creating a weakness on the d3 square and opening lines for future action. Shattering black's symmetrical pawn structure initiates a fascinating tactical dance, creating immediate imbalances and opportunities. This capture ignites a dynamic repositioning. Black recaptures the central pawn, disrupting White's knight on c5 and forcing a reassessment of the pawn structure that was just solidified. The immediate challenge is to see if Black can leverage this knight's new central presence and the open diagonal for the queen against White's slightly exposed kingside. Re-establishing the rook on its active open file immediately addresses the strategic deficit created by the knight's excursion and positions it to challenge Black's central pawn structure, hinting at future pressure along the e-file and potential support for a kingside advance. Reclaiming the e-file, Black immediately confronts White's centralized rook, forcing a decision and potentially opening lines for further pressure. A crucial positional repositioning emerges, aiming to activate the bishop from its somewhat passive square and potentially eye the d5 pawn while creating a more dynamic structure for White's pieces. A subtle repositioning of the knight, aiming to reclaim influence over the d4 square and potentially prepare a kingside pawn advance, seeking to unbalance White's pawn structure. Focusing the queen on the kingside assault, White immediately stakes a claim on the open diagonal and prepares potential knight transfers or an early g4 push, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure around the king. Black's decision to advance the g-pawn to g6 is a pivotal moment, aiming to shore up the kingside and potentially prepare for future queenside expansion or a central break. This creates a dark-squared pawn chain with the f-pawn, which can be a double-edged sword. While it reinforces the king's safety, it also slightly limits the mobility of the king itself and potentially blocks the bishop on f8 if the pawn moves further. Simultaneously, it's a bid for breathing room, creating space for the king to potentially escape any immediate threats that might arise on the kingside. The strategic implication here is a desire for positional solidity, trading some immediate initiative for a more robust defensive structure. Launching a bishop attack on the flank, White initiates a fascinating strategic maneuver aimed at disrupting Black's queenside pawn structure and creating long-term weaknesses. Embracing a more defensive posture, the knight tucks away, preparing to bolster the king's defenses against the encroaching White bishop. Pushing the knight to d4 immediately challenges Black's central pawn structure and opens a direct line of attack towards the f5 square, potentially disrupting the bishop's comfort and creating future tactical opportunities, while also reinforcing the knight's presence in the center and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Unleashing a tactical skirmish, Black reroutes the bishop to f5, igniting diagonal pressure and preparing to contest the e-file, simultaneously challenging White's rook and reinforcing the central pawn structure from a new angle. Clearing the d-file and simplifying the queenside pawns, this exchange immediately alters the positional landscape, aiming to disrupt Black's harmonious piece development and potentially activate White's rooks. Reclaiming central influence and developing a knight towards a more active square is the immediate objective, re-establishing piece harmony after the bishop exchange. Strategically repositioning the bishop to d2 aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside expansion by the knight. Black boldly thrusts the queen to h4, seeking to exploit the kingside's latent weaknesses and create immediate tactical threats, a daring maneuver that dramatically alters the game's complexion by exposing White's monarch to potential discoveries and creating a complex battleground on the open diagonals. Rescuing the queen from that awkward outpost and preparing to contest the open e-file, this repositioning aims to consolidate White's slightly cramped position and re-establish a more balanced pawn structure. Reclaiming the center and preparing to challenge the d4 square, Black simultaneously aims to improve the knight's activity and escape the awkward pin on the c-file, seeking more dynamic counterplay in this congested position. This maneuver by White, 22, g3, fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a significant defensive wall for the king, but simultaneously opening up a diagonal for Black's queen's bishop, a potential long-term vulnerability that must be carefully monitored. Black's queen bravely ventures into enemy territory, challenging the g3 pawn and forcing White to defend, potentially unraveling their queenside structure. Seeking to re-establish central influence, White attempts to reroute the queen to a more active square and simultaneously challenge black's initiative on the queen side by forcing a queen exchange, or at least a repositioning. A daring plunge into enemy territory. Black sacrifices a pawn with this audacious knight sortie, seeking to disrupt white's well-entrenched central pawn structure and potentially create a dangerous outpost for the knight on d3. This move dramatically alters the positional landscape, demanding a sharp calculation from white to assess if the material loss is truly justified by the ensuing tactical complications. The focus now shifts to white's king safety, as black's pieces aim to exploit any lingering weaknesses. Disarming black's powerful bishop battery on the queen side by exchanging, it clears the c-file for white's rook and removes a nagging threat to white's king's safety, aiming for a more stable, less tactical middle game where white can focus on developing a kingside initiative. Unleashing the queen to the active d3 square initiates a fascinating tactical dance, directly challenging white's central control and threatening a fork on white's rook and bishop. Rescuing the bishop from its exposed forward post, white seeks to untangle the position, aiming to consolidate and potentially launch a counterattack on the now precarious black king, which is currently shielded by a wall of pawns but could become a target if the central tension eases. Consolidating the pawn structure after the exchange on d3, black aims to reinforce the center and prepare for further development, perhaps eyeing the d4 square as a future target or a launching pad for their pieces. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust forward creates a dynamic spatial imbalance, simultaneously opening diagonals for white's pieces while potentially compromising the king's immediate safety by weakening the pawn shield. Attempting to dislodge the advanced pawn and reopen lines for attack, this maneuver seeks to improve piece mobility and create attacking chances around white's somewhat exposed king. This bold repositioning of the rook to the third rank aims to create a hidden threat on the king side, potentially supporting a g4-g5 pawn thrust to dislodge black's knight and expose the white king. A bold redirection of the queen, abandoning the central pressure for immediate tactical entanglement on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines against the king. Anchoring the king's safety by reinforcing the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver seeks to blunt black's aggressive intentions and solidify white's defensive posture. Unbalancing the pawn structure on the queenside, this aggressive push aims to pry open lines and exploit white's somewhat cramped position, potentially creating weaknesses for future attacks. Clearing the path for the rook by repositioning the queen aims to exploit the suddenly open h-file, turning the spotlight onto black's rather exposed king, which has lost its pawn shield and is now susceptible to immediate threats, hinting at a potential mating attack being prepared. Unleashing a pawn break, black shatters white's queenside pawn structure, initiating a fierce struggle for central influence and opening lines that could lead to sharp tactical confrontations. Unleashing a sudden royal assault, this sudden queen repositioning threatens a swift checkmate on h7, forcing black into immediate defensive contortions to shield their exposed king. The knight's retreat to e6 cleverly avoids immediate capture, seeking sanctuary while preparing to potentially reinforce the d5 pawn or even shift towards the queen side, a welcome repositioning after being so passively placed on g7.